Welcome to this special edition of our 2022 webinar series with a rather onerous title of How Can the Lessons of World War I Help Us Avoid World War III? And we're being joined today by a great panel of World War I experts and historians to explore what we can take away from the inadvertent slide into cataclysmic war in 1914 and explore how to avoid similar disasters in 2022. My name is Theo Mayer. I'm the Chief Technologist for the World War I Centennial Commission and the Doughboy Foundation, and your host for the webinar. To get started, I would like to play you a welcome video from the Foundation's chairman, Mr. Dan Dayton. Andrew, would you please roll that video?
I'm Dan Dayton. I'm chairman of the Doughboy Foundation. Thank you for the gift of your time. The geopolitical situation faced by all of us today is arguably more serious than at any time since World War I. So it's a good time to take a look at that situation and ferret out those commonalities between the war in Ukraine and World War I. So, as the title of this program clearly indicates, not to get ourselves into a World War III. Equally deserving of our attention is the displacement of Ukrainians. I found it interesting that there are similarities between the wars in that case, too. According to the 1914-1918 online project, data from a number of different countries indicates that at least 10 million people were displaced, either internally or as a result of fleeing across an international border back in World War I. So if you fast forward to today, according to the UN, more than 12 million people are believed to have fled their homes in Ukraine since that war began. You know, the need for food and shelter and transportation and other services is something that happens every day. You got to eat today. You got to find a place to sleep tonight. You've been so generous with your donations of time and treasure to help get this World War I memorial done here in Washington. Thank you for that. But today I'm going to step aside from that pitch for a minute and ask you to generously support those who are displaced today. Please make a donation. Please make a generous donation. You'll be able to see how it's going during the webinar, and those who watch it later will have an opportunity to give as well. So 100% of your gift, at the request of the Hungarian ambassador to the United States, will go to humanitarian relief in that region, 100% of it. Thanks.
Okay, as Dan mentioned, this event is also a fundraiser for much needed humanitarian relief for the many millions of displaced Ukrainians who are fleeing the war. You can donate at any time during and after the event by using your phone or message app. You simply text WWIIHELP, one word, no spaces, to the number 41444. You'll immediately get a text back that links to the donation page. So you can text WWIHELP, one word, to the number 41444. We'd also like to give a special shout out to some organizations that stepped up in helping us get the word out about this event. The National Association of the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, the American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and a new group helping us increase the registration for this event, the Beaches of Normandy Tours Group. Many thanks to all of you for your help. Now, just before we introduce you to our panel of experts, I'm going to ask Andrew to bring up our donation thermometer to see how we're doing, so you can sort of know what is going on. You know, we're usually pretty soft sell in these webinars, so forgive us for pushing a little harder on this occasion. It's literally a life and death cause. So you can help by texting WWIHELP to 41444. I want to thank the community of interest for the help that you're giving us. We're going to be running this campaign all the way through Juneteenth. That's June 19th, when there'll be a live stream concert of the 369th Experience. The James Reese Europe Tribute Band, who is going to be performing live at the World War I Memorial in Washington, D.C. And more on that later. If you're inspired, please give now. Thank you. Okay, it's time to get to the heart of the matter. It's my privilege to introduce you to a panel of World War I experts as we explore the theme question, how can the lessons of World War I help us avoid World War III? Now, this very question is one that one of our panelists posed as a speech theme when during his World War I book launch on April 6th this year, on the anniversary of America's entry into World War I. Attila Szalay-Berzeviczy is a Hungarian economist and author. The name of his book is In the Centennial Footsteps of the Great War, From Sarajevo to Versailles. Attila also addressed the same question in an interview in Forbes magazine. It was when he was attending the book launch and hearing the panel that prompted Dan Dayton to think this was a really important topic, and maybe one that the Doughboy Foundation could expand on with a webinar and a fundraiser for humanitarian relief. So Attila, thank you very, very much for being the inspiration, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here, and most happy that I managed to inspire this conversation. I'm very positive we will have some very exciting thoughts discussed. I think it's a great topic, very timely.
Thank you. Okay, let me next introduce Professor Sir Hugh Strachan, one of the most respected European experts on World War I. He was a frequent guest on our World War I podcast series, World War I Centennial News. Sir Hugh is the Professor of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews, an Emeritus Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford. Sir Hugh, welcome to the webinar. It's wonderful to see you again.
It's very good to be here. Thank you very much indeed. Or not with you here, but there on the other side of the pond. Very
Virtually is as good as we do it these days, so thank you. All right, our next panelist is Dr. Jennifer Keene, Dean and Professor of History, Wilkinson College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, Chapman University. Dr. Keene is one of our historian advisors and has been with us through several of our educational projects as well. Dr. Keene, welcome.
Thanks so much for the invitation to have a conversation today.
Okay, and finally is one of the pillars of the World War I Centennial, Dr. Libby O'Connell. Dr. O'Connell was the chief historian of the History Channel and continues today as the chief historian emeritus. But most importantly, she's also been a commissioner on the U.S. World War I Centennial Commission for nearly a decade. Dr. O'Connell, it's great to see you. Welcome.
Thank you. Looking forward to our conversation.
So, all right, the title of the webinar is framed as a question. How can the lessons of World War I help us avoid World War III? That's pretty ominous, but maybe not overstated. World War I was an accident, or maybe it was inevitable. So my first question to the panel is addressed to Sir Hugh, but we'll go around to the other panelists as well. On the subject of how World War I got started, how did a relatively minor event in 1914, when a 17-year-old amped up teenager assassinates a duke who was second in line to the Austro-Hungarian crown, spark World War I? Now, on the surface, it doesn't seem like something that would plunge an entire world into a cataclysmic war. Sir Hugh, what happened?
Well, I think that the most object lesson, I'm sure we'll come back to this from the other panelists too, is the ability of a small event to trigger a bigger and wider event. I think what is striking about the current situation is we know we have a big event on our hands, and it's already been running longer than the July crisis of 1914. So in a way, I think there is two other points that I think are significant here for us in terms of lesson learning, and any historian is sort of hesitant about the lessons being too direct or too obvious because history doesn't repeat itself. But the first of those would be, certainly for people in Western Europe, is that both world wars in 1914 as well as in 1939 began in Eastern Europe, a long way from Britain or France, and yet directly involving them. The clash between Austria-Hungary and Serbia in the Balkans in July 1914, and of course the German invasion of Poland in 1939. And particularly for a Brexit-minded Britain, it's a moment to remind most Britons, not that they need much reminding, that actually continental Europe is very close and that we're intimately part of it, and it's very hard not to be part of what happens even at the other side of the continent. And the second point I would make, and I think this is probably crucially important in the way that the crisis unrolled, is that nobody could say at the moment of the assassination in Sarajevo where the end point would be. But within just over a month, that Britain, the last of the great powers of 1914 to enter the war, would enter the war. And indeed, on the side of the Central Powers, at the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, and Germany in particular, the hope that Britain wouldn't enter the war. In other words, Britain, by its ambiguity about its own position, by having to play it long, principally because of the pressures of democratic politics and the lack of cabinet unity in the United Kingdom on the issue, that in itself meant that the deterrence structures which were in place then, created by alliances, didn't hold. Britain knew that ultimately it would come into this war if if France and Russia, its sides, were in the war, but it couldn't possibly say that publicly without creating a public ruction. The time Britain entered the war, the British people were united, and I suppose that's another point to make about this crisis. We often think about war enthusiasm by the last week of July across European capitals, and embracing of this. And what's striking at the moment is the degree of public engagement in this war, the degree of a public sense of Ukrainians' right to defend itself, and that this is a just war, which has produced almost an unparalleled response, certainly in my own country, but increasingly in the United States, and also, of course, crucially in the countries adjacent to Ukraine itself.
Well, let me open this up to the rest of the panel. Are there any comments that you all would like to add to those thoughts?
I'll add something.
Yeah, please.
Well, I would just add what changes this from a European war to a world war in 1914. That, I mean, the nomenclature used in the United States in 1914 was the European War. It wasn't the Great War, the World War. And of course, the answer to that is that once the stalemate was created along the Western Front, and it became clear this was not going to be a quick conflict, a war of movement, as say the Franco-Prussian War had been in the latter parts of the 19th century, that the fact that Britain and France, and to a certain extent Germany, were imperial powers and could call on their colonial resources to expand immediately the scope of resources and manpower coming to Europe, and then of course, eventually turning to the US, Britain, especially the US as its primary financial and trade partner to begin to provide materials. So I think the question here is also applicable. I mean, what changes this from a regional conflict, which is really how Russia is somewhat positing it, at least initially. What makes this have the potential of turning into a world war? And that is the involvement of the US and it becoming a proxy standoff between the US, which is still now really the sole superpower, but against a maybe lesser power in Russia, but still a nuclear power. And that global reach that especially the US has is what can transform something into something more major. And in that sense, I think the analogy is a good one because just as in World War I, it was an incremental escalation. It came out of stalemate. So if we have stalemate, as we seem to have in Ukraine, is this the moment in which we start seeing incremental escalation that in fact broadens not just the scope of the conflict, but the stakes of the conflict? And that's where I think we can definitely see draw some insights from what happens. Maybe more in the beginning of 1915 than 1914.
Any other thoughts on this? Yes, Libby, please.
I really appreciated Jennifer's remark about the proxy war. But one thing that makes this more different and more dangerous than earlier proxy wars is that the fight is actually with the Russians. There isn't the proxy. I mean, there are the Eastern Ukrainians, some of whom are pro-Russian. But in other proxy wars, it's been two superpowers fighting through the forces who are directly in conflict with each other. This is different because Russia has sent its own troops in. So we may be using proxies, but they're not. They are right there. Their men are dying. They're representing themselves.
Attila, any comment from you?
Yeah, Hugh made a very valid point about Eastern Europe, that it's always the center of problems when we talk about world wars. And you may ask the question, why is that? Why not Western Europe? And I came to the conclusion that the big wars are always started by autocratic regimes, autocratic countries. Wars cannot be started by liberal democracies because simply people would not support that, and politicians who make the decision need to go to the elections every 4 years. So wars can be started by autocrats, and Eastern Europe is in the crossroads of throughout the history of 4 huge autocratic empires: the Russian, the German, the Austrian, and the Ottoman. And the tectonic movement of the changes of balance between these powers usually ended up in conflicts. And also we got rid of 3 of these empires in the past, let's say 80 years, but we still have the Russians there. And this is why Central Eastern Europe is a very special area within Europe and in the Northern Hemisphere. And this is why this war is definitely an alarming situation, an alarming event, because it reminds me to the Austro-Hungarian move on 28th of July, 1914. So if the war started by Austria-Hungary going into a punitive campaign against Serbia, and they did this because they thought they can do it. It will be a swift punishing campaign, and we'll take Belgrade, and that's it. And Austria-Hungary did this because their security concern was Serbia. So I see a parallel when Russia is saying that Ukraine is a concern to its own national security, and we go in and we'll get things done there quickly. And then they are just as wrong as Austria-Hungary was in July 1914.
Well, a great question. And a lot of what's coming up are, and the conversation is about parallels. So the next question that I'd like to dig into this a little bit further with are some of the disturbing parallels between World War I and today. And this one is going to go to you, Dr. Keene. In all the interlocking mutual defense treaties between the European nations and empires, that was clearly the slippery slope that we slid down into a global war 100 years ago. Is the parallel to NATO and the United Nations treaties as parallels, Sweden and Finland coming into NATO and so forth, is that as provocative as it seems?
That's a big question.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Well, let me start by saying maybe a little rephrasing of building on something that you mentioned about, these defensive alliances that predated the outbreak of war in 1914 and what sort of role they played in as a sort of causal agent in the conflict actually happening. And I think that sometimes we look at those, and I love what they seem to imply that we believe about humankind or about governments, that they're so honorable. So they sign these defensive alliances and they're honor bound to actually, fulfill them. And they do to the letter, because of course that's what honorable nations do. And of course, a war to begin with is breaking a lot of rules. And the reason I say that is that there's nothing in 1914, and I don't think there's anything with NATO that sort of foretells an inevitability of armed conflict on the part of all parties. That in 1914, when you take the cases of yes, there were the defensive alliances, which I interpret more as expressions of mutual interest that nations see that they have, and they're meant to be deterrents. They're meant to be deterrents against an invasion, and I don't want to go through all of them, but in the idea that you run the risk of, in fact, drawing in, other nations. But as the case of Germany, when it invades Belgium, the idea is they can do it fast enough so that they'll just force Britain to kind of accept the situation as it is, and they'll have to renegotiate. But in every case as well, there is a domestic conversation that's going on, and you have to sell the war to your leader, to your population. And it's very rarely going to be good enough to just say, well, we promised we'd come. That there has to be a sense of self-interest in a way in which a leader can express, or government can express to his people, that this is in fact something that needs to be done because it's in the best interest of that particular nation. And I think you certainly saw in 1914, Germany acting on its, it's the time is now, we have to break out of encirclement, Russia and France, the time is now to stop France, Britain, what does it look like if Germany controls the continent, and America making a somewhat similar calculation in 1917 with Wilson, that by that point coming to the decision that a German-dominated Europe would be directly antithetical to American national interests. So yes, you have the alliances, but we can't make too much of the idea that these predict then conflict, once the dominoes start to fall, which I think is an unfortunate way that we still teach the origins of the First World War in the United States. And I think it actually makes it harder in the American context then for people to be supportive of these alliances like NATO or expanding NATO, because they see it then as a kind of inevitable, one trigger and boom, everything happens. And, the rejection of America of the Versailles Peace Treaty was in part a lot based on that belief. So I think that it's the expansion of these alliances is concerning, but at the end of the day, it's going to be the decisions that are made within those alliances that are more important. That's where I would really leave it. So I don't know what obviously, if I knew what was going to happen, I wouldn't be here. I'd be somewhere else. but what I would say is that I think that is a lesson you can draw from that when we forget that a lot of times, and Putin's made this calculation, we think war is always the thing to be avoided, but there are leaders and governments in the world that don't try to avoid war. They see war as calculated risks that are going to further their interests. And that happened a lot in 1914. And we just, I think, as Attila was sort of suggesting, in democracies tend not to think that way, but it doesn't mean that it's not happening. And so that's,
that makes sense.
I'm not sure I really answered your question, but I think I spoke around it. So
well, it's okay. Sure, any thoughts from you?
Yeah. Well, yes, I mean, to reinforce what Jennifer's just said, effectively, none of the original belligerents come in because of alliance commitments. I mean, Germany has given this promise to Austria-Hungary, but doesn't actually think Austria-Hungary is going to cash the blank check at the beginning of the crisis. They, as Attila said, essentially, Austria-Hungary is fighting its own war with Serbia, and indeed many in Berlin don't think that they'll even get that far because they've backed down in previous crises or not had the resolve in previous crises. The big difference, of course, is that NATO has Article 5, and there is therefore a commitment which was not present in any of the 1914 alliances. I mean, the 1914 alliances were, like NATO, predicated on the idea of defense, not offense, mutual support in those circumstances. But we have effectively committed ourselves in advance for deterrent reasons. That is significant, and it's particularly significant as Finland and Sweden apply to become members, because as has been regularly pointed out, NATO is actually entering a whole sequence of additional obligations. This is not a free ride. There is a way in which NATO has responded as though it is, that it reinforces the alliance, and of course in many respects it does, to have the authority of two very well prepared, resilient countries as allies. But at another level, of course, it extends the frontier with Russia and the frontier to be defended. The country that has always acted, as Ukraine has done, as the buffer, as the in-between bit. The other thing, the point I'd make is that international relations theorists, I'm bizarrely now meant to be a professor of international relations, but that's completely bogus. I'm a historian. International relations theorists remain very fond of the 1914 example as an illustration of how war breaks out. And yet they're very wedded to a different interpretation from the one that we've presented here. And the presentation essentially is that Germany is going for great power status. It's an argument derived very largely from the 1960s or even from the Versailles peace agreement with its presumption of German war guilt. And bizarrely, of course, in some ways, this crisis reflects that interpretation of the First World War's origins that most historians today would support, which is to see it, as indeed they saw it in the 1930s, as a breakdown of the international order. What we're seeing here is a major power acting in a directly aggressive fashion, in the way in which Fritz Fischer, writing in the 1960s, opted to interpret Germany. And we believe that deterrence is the answer to that. But that immediately puts credibility on the line if there is a crisis. And actually, the great powers in 1914, as we've all been suggesting, have much more wiggle room than we've left ourselves if there were to be.
In this case. Yeah, in this case, definitely. Any other thoughts from Libby or Attila?
So in 1914, I think the Central Powers and the Entente were pretty much level field players. We're not talking about America coming into the war, we're talking about 1914. Now, this is not the case. So NATO is an absolute most powerful military alliance. It has no match in the world. So it is obvious also that it has a very, very efficient marketing machine. More efficient than Germany was in 1914. This is Russia, because everyone is rushing into NATO because of Russia. When the political changes happened in Eastern Europe, we rushed into NATO voluntarily, happily. Nobody had to come here to convince us that it's a good place to be for us. So it is not true that NATO is expanding to the neighborhood of Russia aggressively, because all of us in the Baltic states, here in Eastern Europe, also we here in Hungary, we went into NATO because of Russia.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very, very good point. Libby, do you have any comment? Please.
I just wanted to amplify some of the comments from Sir Hugh and Jennifer about the idea that people had choices, despite the fact that there were these treaties that they were not required. They could have thought through in World War I. And there's a historian, I'm afraid his name escapes me right now, who used the phrase sleepwalkers. It's like, this is our destiny. We have the treaties. We are not going to sit down, take a step back and evaluate. And I think that it's really important right now that we do not respond as, that NATO does not respond as a sleepwalker.
Yeah. Great points. Okay, so an amazing discussion. We're going to take sort of a metaphorical sorbet and clear our palates between questions. And I'd like to ask Andrew.
Why metaphorically?
Well, I don't have any. But I'd like to ask Andrew to bring up our fundraising thermometer. So we're well down. I can't do the percentage real quickly in my head, but we're well on our way. I want to thank everybody who is actually donating. You know, again, from an appeal standpoint, if you are moved to donate, you can text WWIII, one word, to the number 41444. There's now 12 million people who've been displaced in Ukraine, and they're desperately needing our help, and you can make a difference. And by the way, if you're uncomfortable with your name showing up in the campaign scroll, when you're filling out the donation, near the end, there's a little checkbox and you can make your donation anonymous. So please feel free to do that. We really want to thank everybody who's stepping up, everyone who's joined us today, and those who'll be watching this on demand, and of course, our great panelists, which gets us back to our next question. Okay, it's over to you, Dr. O'Connell. The subject is another parallel, and I know you have a personal relationship to this one as well. This time it's about neutrality. In 1914, until we actually declared war in 17, America stood firmly on the ground of neutrality. We're not going to get into a shooting war in Europe. Sounds very familiar. In the meantime, you know, we're making huge financial loans. We're supplying money and arms and materiel to the Allies, basically to one side. It sounds a lot like what the West, and especially the US, are doing right now in Ukraine. How did that work in World War I, and how did we slide down that slippery slope? And what are your thoughts?
Well, there are some things that were going on in the United States that we shouldn't forget as reasons to remain impartial in thought and deed, which is the way Wilson described our responsibility. One of the things we had, or when we still have a sizable German-American community, but at that time it was even larger in relationship to the whole population. And it was a robust part of our society and a respected one. And I think that the German Americans and the Irish Americans did play a role in keeping more neutrality or balancing the pro-British and pro-French feeling initially. But I mean, we're all confident or comfortable with the idea of the sort of steps towards war of the submarine warfare, the sinking of the Lusitania pretty early, 1915. My great-great-grandmother died and was drowned at that sinking. Germany saying they will no longer use submarines against civilian and trade shipping, right? But they can continue it other ways. So there was restrictions against submarine warfare. The amount of loans that we are giving, that American banking is providing to the Allies, is around $2.2 billion. The amount of loans American bankers are giving to the Germans is about 27 million. We have stark economic interests in supporting our allies. The amount of trade that we have with Britain has gone up by 300%. We're providing food and we are providing material. So we are no longer neutral the way
in name only.
Yeah, we're neutral in name only. And then in of course, the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, the Bolshevik victory or taking power changes the status of the Eastern Front, and allows Germany to bring more troops back to Western Europe. And then of course there's a Zimmerman telegram, which I think is sort of the big moment that we see as changing everything, but that the march towards declaration of war was in process when the Zimmerman telegram that reveals, thanks to the British decoders.
Well, you bring up a good point, Libby, the fact that the melting pot aspect of why neutrality was going and so forth. I just find some of the parallels with what's happening now, particularly in a very direct sort of approach to supplying arms and resources.
But we're not hearing a lot from Russian Americans. We're hearing a lot of people just supporting the Ukraine. There isn't
the melting pot thing. Yeah,
this isn't a protest. I'm sure there's some, but that's not what we're hearing in the press. That there's a whole group of Americans who are saying, no, take a step back. Russia's doing the right thing. It's okay. We shouldn't fight them.
Can I raise a quick point? I agree entirely with what Libby says, but one of the consequences of the economic mobilization, which the First World War generated, and from Germany, indeed, the US had lost its neutrality by virtue of its contribution to the war effort. One of the economic consequences was that it was very hard for any neutral to remain unaffected by this war. And what we're seeing now, not least thanks to sanctions, but also because of the food shortage which the war in Ukraine is generating, and the inflationary effects that it's having across European societies, is that no country stands fully outside this war. I mean, there are plenty of powers across the world who are trying to remain neutral, who are hedging their bets, who are not supporting Ukraine or Russia in this, and some, of course, who are supporting Russia rather than Ukraine, but not in the wider West. But all those countries are affected by the war. And as the sanctions bite and as the economic consequences bite, then actually it's very hard to will become very hard to remain detached from this war. Neutrality becomes a relative term rather than an absolute term. At the moment, of course, we're thinking about the compromise in the neutrality of the NATO members because of the contribution they're making to the war effort. Proxy war is still not a phrase that either, I suspect, President Biden or any European leader is prepared to accept as one appropriate for NATO. But it's one self-evidently used by the Russians of the NATO countries for entirely understandable reasons. It's the correct way for us to look at it. But the point at which that also widens so that other countries, which are not NATO members, become compromised as well, it will come in due course, just because they will be sucked in. If I can make one other very quick point about US neutrality in 1917, of course, the Germans could take a risk with American neutrality because they thought the United States was not a significant military power.
Fair enough.
That doesn't apply.
They were right.
But
Yeah.
I think Russia thought that we are not strong enough. The West is weak these days, especially after the pandemics. All the topics that is dividing the Western societies.
Mhm.
And they knew that well-functioning democracies are very unwilling to go to war because people are not supporting to go to war very easily. So as long as there's no direct threat, a military threat, like Pearl Harbor, yeah, you may have sympathy for the refugees, for whatever is going on in Europe. But this time, you're facing a nuclear power.
Mhm.
And that's much more scary, more worse than Germany, the Imperial Germany used to be, or the Nazi Germany. And this power already surprised the world. So in a poker terms, Putin immediately started with an all-in.
Mhm.
And then you're sitting there with your cards, and it's quite scary situation to make a decision if you want to continue this round or you just drop your cards.
And again, incredible point. Dr. Keene, any thoughts?
I think neutrality is a useless concept for understanding really much of what happens in 1914 to 1917 and much of what's happening now. Inaction is action. It's still making a decision and it has an impact. I don't think that neutrality, what is neutrality? Doing nothing, treating both sides fairly, or it's equally, it becomes its own kind of argument over what neutrality means and how do we stay neutral. But when in fact, the minute you begin unpacking it, you see impact because we're a globally interconnected set of societies and nations, whether it's through politics or defense structures or trade. And so just like you were saying, and that even a nation who says we're not going to pick a side is impacted, and there's just almost no way in a world event like this not to either be impacted or have an impact. And to me that it's when we say neutrality, what we really mean is non-belligerence, and it's a sense of we're not actively fighting in the conflict, but that it doesn't take you more than 2 seconds to unpack the idea that America is not neutral ever. I mean, it's always doing something that's impacting the war, right? So no, I mean, this is not against you. I mean, it's a term that gets thrown around. And so to me, it's better for us not to get too wrapped up in the idea of neutrality or even the expectation of it, but instead to be thinking about the degrees, the decisions that are being made and the kinds of actions that are being taken or not being taken. If you were talking about humanitarian aid today, and the idea of seeing suffering and wanting to do something to alleviate it. But that is actually making a political declaration about your sentiments and your thoughts about what is happening in Ukraine. And that doesn't mean not to do it, but it's not a neutral act. I mean, donating philanthropically to help refugees is a political act, and it's making a political expression from the grassroots about where people's sentiments are and where they believe the wrong is and where the wrong needs to be righted. And that,
of course,
to me,
and perhaps the term should have been military neutrality, right?
I mean, that's just what I would say.
Yeah. Okay. So, and everybody should think about this a little bit, because we're going to do one of these, in a few word kinds of things. And what I'm going to ask everybody to do is to kind of do a summary from a summary perspective about, this is something, Attila, I know you've thought a lot about, not only as an author, but as a regional resident and as an expert on this. What would you say, if you had to boil it down, are the top 3 lessons from World War I for the diplomats and the various governments and stakeholders to keep in their minds to help us avoid repeating the terrible World War I history as they grapple with the crisis between Russia and Ukraine? This is a hard one because I'm asking, shorter is harder than longer. And so let's take a round on this one.
Well, as I said at the beginning, the big wars are always started as small wars, always started by autocratic nations who are driven by historic grievance. They have something to compensate. And the big problem with these countries that the military is not under civil oversight. And because of this, they typically report to a warlord, the ruler, the autocrat, emperor. And for that reason, checks and balances are switched off. They tend to make mistakes, and they overestimate their powers, and they always underestimate the country that they are invading. And these mistakes lead to escalation. So small wars through mistakes can tend to end up in world wars.
I'm definitely taking that as a takeaway. And as far as, wars are started by autocratic nations is a really, really great point. Sir Hugh, let me jump to you. And what would your summarization be?
Well, I think the first thing is it's probably much easier to get into a war than to get out of one. The United States doesn't need reminding of that right now, nor do any of the rest of us really. This war is going to be very hard to get out of, and that's particularly the case.
Really good point.
Has become essentially bogged down. It's being decided essentially by fighting that is not producing much movement or much in the way of a breakthrough. It is in a position where neither side has a secure negotiating position. So the second point would be, at what point do you begin that dialogue? How do you begin that dialogue in order to enable the war to come to an end? And I see nothing happening at the moment that makes that possible, not least because for Ukraine, what began as a war to defend its eastern frontier has now increasingly become a war to recover its 1991 borders. And that in itself is going to generate escalation. The second thing, if I'm still, I think I'm probably on the third thing now. The third thing would be, if it's going to escalate, think very hard how it's going to escalate. I think we are naturally and rightly preoccupied with the question of nuclear weapons. I actually think part of the problem there is because we haven't been thinking about nuclear weapons enough in the last 3 decades. We're still having to get our heads around it and our heads around the way in which they might play out in the context of an ongoing war, as opposed to a deterrent to prevent war in the first place. In other words, how does intra-war deterrence play out? But I think as we think about that, we also need to recognize that actually the escalation, the capacity of this war to escalate is not going to be, certainly in the immediate sense, an all-out nuclear exchange. We're creating a bogeyman here, which is preventing us from looking at how it's much more likely to escalate, which is probably geographically. And Attila has cause for concern about that. Those living in Poland have cause for concern about that. If weapons are being brought into Ukraine from Western countries, then the transit points are obvious targets for Russia. The expansion in maritime sense into the Black Sea is another obvious point of expansion. And of course, the reciprocal side of it. If Ukraine is going to win this war, if Ukraine is actually going to regain its pre-2014 frontiers, then it's going to have to take the war into areas which are now defined as Russia, at least by Russia, and which, of course, many of the population within those territories regard as Russian too.
Yeah, they do.
So it's going to be a different situation from fighting with basically a pretty solid Ukrainian population, even if there are some Ukrainians who are pro-Russian, the numbers seem to be diminishing rather than expanding.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be very different if they are actually pursuing a war which has wider war aims. Those, I don't have any solutions to any of those problems. Those are my three big issues.
Libby, let me then go to you and get your thoughts on this.
Well, this isn't as flip as it may sound, but I think important advice to the diplomats and people in foreign relations who are thinking about this issue is to have historians in the room. Mm-hmm. And not just military historians, but cultural historians who have a better idea of what's at work inside people's own cultures, pushing them in these areas, towards this. I also think that just as we were talking about World War I, it's important to remember to think through things frequently. Don't just think thoughtfully, make a decision, and then stop thinking thoughtfully. When you make one decision, you have to keep reevaluating the situation. And I just want to reemphasize what Sir Hugh said about how can you imagine the peace process where people can leave and countries can leave with some sense of dignity. Mm-hmm. I mean, what you don't want to, if you are able to restore peace, you don't want to have one of the actors being so angry that that's not going to be peaceful, is it? I mean, they're just going to keep retrying.
Libby, my fourth question was all about Versailles and how do we not do that and so forth. So I'm glad you guys are touching on this because we're not going to.
I jumped ahead. I'm sorry. So
no, we don't have time for it. We don't have time for it. So
yep.
I'm really glad you went.
Jennifer, you go. I finished.
Yeah.
So I'm actually going to kind of pick up on that. Well, can I go? If Theo didn't actually give me the green light, you just did. There. Well, it is that idea of thinking more about Versailles, because we're all focusing a little bit on, how do you end things well? And to me, I would caution to remember that if America is seen as the leader in the world who is leading NATO and putting, whether it's, with troops in the field or with aid or with diplomacy, sort of helping the world manage and maneuver through this crisis, then what happens domestically in domestic politics matters to the world. And I will just say that we are a few years out from a presidency where the conversation was about leaving NATO. And also, the events that we've been having about Ukraine on my campus, we always have a group of students who get up and say, why are we so concerned about Ukraine and we did nothing in Ethiopia? We're doing nothing in Yemen. Right. And of course, every racially motivated mass murder that we have in the United States then brings this back into people's consciousness, because they're not disputing the need to help Ukraine, but the heavy emphasis on it seems to reinforce the racist nature of American society because of our disinterest as Americans in other humanitarian conflict, crises and in conflict zones. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's really on two different poles from the left and the right that you already see potential for frayings of this unity in terms of American support for Ukraine. And I think that is what we saw in the First World War, that because of sedition laws and the impossibility of actually criticizing the war, you had this facade of unity around Wilson's vision about how the war was going to end. But as he lost political power, the Democrats lost political power, and you started seeing the reemergence of isolationist sentiment in the United States. That ending didn't materialize in the way that Wilson had envisioned it. And so the caution here is that these currents for the moment are not predominant, but we're maybe one election away from that coming back out. And I think that's to say that again, I'm not sure it's a lesson, but it's a sense that in a way, what happens domestically, politically in the United States matters more to the world than maybe in other nations because of the role that America plays internationally. And I do see strong parallels between Versailles in that sense and potentially what could happen here.
Thank you. Well, it's amazing how fast time goes by. We are going to hold here, and we're going to see if we go a few minutes over. I hope it's okay, because I do want to get to at least a couple of questions from the audience, if we can. Chris Christopher has been moderating the Q&A room. Chris, as often happens, some of the questions have come up over and over and over again. Do you have one that sort of predominated?
You know, amazingly enough, we have a whole question thing full of individual discrete questions. Not a lot of the same, but one I think is important here. With Nick asks, does cutting off trade, implementing sanctions, and other ways that we are isolating Russia from the global stage actually push them away from war in Ukraine, or does it make them more determined? I'm wondering what the parallels are from cutting Russia off and how Germany was cut off due to the British naval blockade that led to the turnip winter. What similarities and differences do you see, and is that method more beneficial or more harmful?
So I'm going to ask you to do this short, which is unfair, but I will. And let me start with Attila.
Well, sanctions, what we are doing now is a big test for avoiding military, so battlefield conflicts. Because if we can actually, if sanctions can work, and obviously nobody can tell at this time, but we will later know what was in vain, what was too little. But this is certainly the first time that the financial system and the entire economy is put into action during a war. So this big test will tell us if we can fight wars only on the battlefields, or we can avoid the battlefields and make wars shorter through the financial system.
Sir Hugh, how about yourself?
To take the turnip winter point, in other words, this winter of 1916, which incidentally was a bad winter for everybody, irrespective of whether they were on the receiving end of the blockade or not, just as the next winter was a bad winter. In other words, bad weather as well as economic warfare had an effect. But the point remains that when revolution came in the Central Powers, and it came very speedily and very late, not in Russia, interestingly, in other words, an Entente power, but in Germany and Austria-Hungary, it came very late, although food shortages have been a feature for months, if not years, from 1916 onwards. And when it came, it coincided with military collapse as well. In other words, it did not in itself bring about the collapse of Germany and Austria-Hungary in the First World War. It did in conjunction with other things, and revolution then followed. But of course, the consequence of revolution too was that then there was a very disordered world to try to put back together again. I mean, the problem at Versailles was that you were dealing with civil war, you were dealing with violence across Eastern and Central Europe, and that was stoked, of course, by Wilson arguing for a principle of national self-determination. Yeah. So it's not self-evident that sanctions will have an effect in any medium term. They might in the long term, and it is not self-evident that the effects will be ones that you actually want to wish for.
Libby, how about yourself?
I'm sort of stumped on this. I think it's a really difficult question. We just don't know how much it's going to work. And there are other things, remember, that we haven't even raised today that are ways of attacking your enemy's well-being that do not involve nuclear weapons, but involve destroying the American power grid. Not too hard to do. getting into people's water supply, doing things that don't require sending soldiers, don't require the immediate loss of life, just a lot of, bringing societies to a standstill. And I see that as a possibility of retaliatory sanctions to the allies, to NATO countries.
Social disruption by itself.
Yeah. Turn off your Wi-Fi. Turn off the Wi-Fi. I'm not kidding. I mean, people just would freak out if you closed off the communications in this country.
Dr. Keene.
But we wouldn't know about it.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I do definitely think the cybersecurity issues and and that is certainly a different way that this war is being fought, or that people are being impacted by it. I mean, we've had some Russian bot farms attack some events that we've done. We learned the hard way to nail things down. But I was going to sort of add into this in terms of another parallel is the role of disease. And of course, we have the influenza pandemic in 1918, and we're still not through. I think we were saying this earlier in the webinar conversation. We might be done with coronavirus, but clearly it's not done with us. And I also think that the way in which malnutrition itself and the destruction of infrastructure breeds disease. I mean, we think about Herbert Hoover and aiding Belgium in 1915 and 1916, but of course that food mission and that the Red Cross's humanitarian aid extended well into the 20s, into former, enemy areas where typhus epidemics and all these problems that create suffering outside of the sort of parameters we attach to when a war begins and when a war ends, and not to mention the civil war aspect of it, which I think is another danger we see in Ukraine. So it really is a kind of Pandora's box when you open it up and you think at the high level of even military conflict, but of course the civilian impact is already severe and likely not to be alleviated anytime soon, and the imposition of blockades or economic sanctions, as we know, only exacerbate that. And so it's been a difficult tool for us to use effectively. I'm not sure there is a conflict in history where you can argue that it has ultimately had the intended impact it was meant to have.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad we're not a broadcast, because I would right now be off the air, but we're definitely an incredible session. We will try to get all of your questions answered offline. In the meantime, Sir Hugh, Dr. Keene, Dr. O'Connell, Attila, you've all been incredible. You've been so generous with your time and your thoughts. And the discussion on how the lessons from World War I apply to the crisis in 2022. And I want to thank you all.
Thank you.
It's a big topic.
Listen, we don't like to go small. Yeah.
Sure.
And speaking of giving generously, here it comes. Let's take a look at the fundraising thermometer and see how it's gone for this hour. It's actually quite good. We got over halfway on the goal. I want you to know that this campaign is going to continue on through Juneteenth. We're going to be live streaming an amazing concert by the 369th Experience, the tribute band for the 369th Regimental Band that brought jazz to Europe. It's going to be at the National World War Memorial in Washington, D.C. So everyone attending today will be sending you details out to you in the next couple of weeks to attend that. I want to thank you for your generous donations. It's really been great. I want to thank all the attendees. The webinar will be posted on the Doughboy Foundation website. We're going to put it under doughboy.org/lessons. A huge thank you to our panel, Attila Szalay-Berzeviczy, Professor Sir Hugh Strachan, Dr. Jennifer Keene, Dr. Libby O'Connell. This webinar was presented by the Doughboy Foundation in partnership with the Hungarian Embassy. Many thanks to Ambassador Szabolcs for his support. The technical director was Andrew McReel. The line producer was Kathy Abbott. Audience support and Q&A coordination by Chris Christopher. And my name is Teo Mayer. It's been an honor to have hosted and moderated this amazing day. Thank you. So long.